All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's noon here in rainy Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am. So I will say good afternoon, but also maybe good morning, good evening, because we know not everyone is on the same time zone. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. My name is Nicole Bryant. I am the managing director of the Program on Negotiation, and I am very pleased to bring everyone together today for this edition of PON Live featuring Catherine Kaufman of Harvard Business School, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before I get to our distinguished guest, a little word about what brings us together today. So, as many of you know, the Program on Negotiation is a research group focused for over 40 years now on research, but also curriculum development and executive trainings related to the fields of negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And for the past couple of years now, we've been delighted to offer a series of free live webinars to our community on topics both related to negotiation and also negotiation adjacent. So I would like to thank, as ever, the incredible PON staff who does so much work helping to set all of these up. Laura Sampietro, Riley Schretzel, and Kenneth Russell. Very grateful for them and all of their work getting us to this point. I'm also grateful to all of our community who has come and joined in. We look forward to engaging with you throughout the course of today's session. So today we will have a presentation by our speaker for about 40 minutes, and after that we will open it up to Q&A from the audience. So if you have a question, we will invite you to put it in the Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All right, and without further ado, I will formally introduce today's guest. Catherine Kaufman is the Piramal Associate Professor of Business Administration in the Negotiations, Organization, and Markets Unit of Harvard Business School. She uses experimental methods to study individual, team, and managerial decision-making, and often with a focus on gender stereotypes in shaping beliefs. We're really lucky to get to spend the next hour in her company. And so without further ado, Professor Kaufman, I will invite you to take the Zoom stage and present your wonderful work on capitalizing the best ideas and talent. So Katie, thank you so much. Oh, and you're on Zoom. You're on mute.
Yeah. Okay. Fabulous. Thank you so much, Nicole, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to talk with you today and hear questions and reactions and your experiences in the world. We're going to be talking about capitalizing on the best ideas and talent. So I want to start with an example, and this is an example from an organization I've done some work with, the Innovation Office at Mass General Brigham. And so the Innovation Office at Mass General Brigham is essentially tasked with taking all of the amazing research and ideas that come out of the clinicians and researchers who work at this huge healthcare organization and helping bring those ideas to market so that the organization both can increase revenue, but also really provide sort of patient impact and care at scale. And one of the things they've noticed over the last several years is that despite having a huge and hugely talented group of potential innovators, only a very small fraction of these individuals were actually participating in the innovation process. And so this is actually a graphic that Mass General Brigham provided that looks at sort of, this set of overlapping circles illustrating sort of what they see as really the tiny fraction of potential innovators who are stepping in. And so one of the things that's going to motivate today's talk is really understanding problems like this in a variety of organization where there's a concern that maybe we have ideas, we have talent, we have untapped potential in various ways, and thinking about, well, what are some of the reasons that that potential remains untapped, and what might we as leaders, as managers, do to actually think about bringing forward this potential and capitalizing on it? And so, one of the key things we're going to focus on today is thinking about sort of stereotypes and biases and the role they play in sort of driving many of these decisions. And so, when you hear stereotypes, you hear biases, oftentimes we think about sort of the impact that those forces have on our beliefs about other people. Um, One of the things that I study in my research is the way in which those same forces, in particular, the sort of social stereotypes, those widely shared views of sort of who's good at what, shape our beliefs about ourselves, right? And fundamentally, so many of the decisions we make, whether educationally or in our careers, come down to these questions of like, am I good enough? How do I measure up? So if we think about, whether we're going to initiate a negotiation or take a certain course or apply for a promotion or volunteer an idea, right? At the heart of that decision in many instances is the question of like, is this an idea or am I worth volunteering? And so I'm going to go through just a series of studies that I've done sort of related to these types of decisions. First, we're going to think about sort of illustrating the problem and the ways it might manifest in different settings. And then we'll, start to think about, okay, so what do we do about it? And of course, that's going to be sort of the key question, not so much the descriptive angle, but the sort of, okay, what's the management challenge or the organizational challenge and how do we meet it? And so let's start with a really concrete example. So maybe you can reflect back to a recent sort of meeting you were in or a project team you were a part of. I hope it's not true, but I'm guessing it is based upon my own and others' experiences that oftentimes we're in these rooms and the person with sort of the loudest voice or the most influence was not necessarily the person who most knew what they were talking about. And of course, this is a version of sort of failure to capitalize on the best ideas, right? We're hearing from someone who happens to be perhaps most confident, but not necessarily most competent in the domain. And so in this project, what we really tried to understand is sort of thinking about these team decision-making settings. What predicts the decision to come forward with an idea? We view this as really fundamentally important, right? Because the quality of a group's decision is really bounded by its inputs, right? If the best ideas or good ideas aren't being volunteered, we're not going to be able to implement those as a team. And so the angle we're going to take in this study is trying to understand the role that self-stereotyping, particularly around sort of self-confidence, shapes decisions about whether to volunteer ideas. And so the method we're going to use here is actually designing a laboratory experiment where we bring participants, in this case, college students, into the lab and we put them in different situations and try and see how they behave. And to the extent that we see differences across individuals or across contexts, try and understand through sort of careful questions what might be driving those differences. And so here's just like a brief overview of what this experiment looks like. So we provide sort of a test of individuals' either knowledge or ability across a wide range of domains. And so we choose these domains to vary quite deliberately across sort of different gender stereotypes. And I'll be a little bit clearer about what I mean by that in another slide. So we're going to measure how much they know. Then we're going to ask them to make decisions about how willing they are to speak up in these different areas with an idea to the group. We're going to measure sort of how confident they are in their ideas. And then they'll also do some sort of listening to other ideas and decide how much they trust them. All right, so that part one I mentioned. So we're going to measure knowledge across 6 different categories. So here are the categories: arts and literature, entertainment and pop culture, environmental science, history, geography, and sports and games. Okay, so the way we choose these categories is we want to have a mix of things there where sort of the popular belief or the stereotype is that women tend to be, a little bit more knowledgeable in these areas than men, versus other categories where the belief is men might be more knowledgeable than women. Okay. So we're going to ask people a variety of multiple choice questions in each of those domains to get a sense of how much they know. right? This last bullet point is just we're going to force them to respond, right? So they're going to have to guess even when they're unsure, and that's going to be helpful for sort of thinking about the difference between how much they know and how confident they are. Here we're really focused on how much do they know. After we get a sense of how much they know in these different domains, we're going to put them into teams. And their team member, right, is in the lab at the same time as them, but they don't know who this is, right? And so people are interacting much like they are over a computer terminal, right? And so they know the other person's in the room, but they don't see them. They're not speaking directly with them, right? They're going to see new questions and questions. They're two things, right? What do you think the answer to this question is, right? So if I asked you this question on your own, just privately, what would you as the answer? And then the second part, which is how willing are you to have the answer as the group answer, right? And this is important because in this stage of the experiment, the group. And so we have an incentive as a team to have the person who has the best chance of having the right answer the question for us, right? It doesn't matter if it's me or you, we just want to be right. That's how we make money. Okay, so I'm going to be able to look at how willing they are to speak up with an idea. Getting at sort of the mechanism piece, right? We're then going to follow that up in the next stage of the study by showing them those same questions from that group stage before and asking them to estimate what they think the chances are that they answer that question correctly. We'll also ask them to guess what they think the partner's chance of answering it correctly is, so we can get a sense for whether they might be over or underestimating their own and others' ability. All right, so I mentioned trying to sort of vary the gender stereotype of the category, right? So one of the things we want to verify, actually, we've succeeded in drawing questions from categories that vary the stereotype. At the very end of the study, what participants do is they see the different categories they were asked about, sort of whether they think that men know more about. The first thing I'm why is just some evidence that indeed these domains vary quite a bit in terms of how they're perceived by participants. So the blue bars here are the answers from men, orange bars are answers from women, right? And these are just their perceptions of the categories on that -1 to 1 slider scale. And so what you see here is indeed arts and literature and pulp culture are viewed as being sort of female typed, right? The stereotype benefits women, while the other 4 categories, and in particular sports and games, are viewed as more male typed. So 2 quick things to note on this. One is that men and women sort of agree on the relative ordering of these categories, right? It's not that they have totally different views of what the stereotypes are. They seem to have sort of the same sort of ordering across these 6 domains. And what really surprised me in doing this work is actually 2/3 of participants in the study give exactly this ordering when we look at their slider scale perceptions, sort of reinforcing this idea that stereotypes are indeed like widely shared views of sort of, relative talents or abilities. Okay, so we have this variation that's going to be helpful to us because what we're going to do is ask, right, how an individual's both self-confidence and their willingness to speak up is going to depend on the gender stereotype of the domain. So what do we find? Indeed, we find that an individual's willingness to speak up depends on this gender stereotype. So holding fixed how much they actually know, and we can do that in a lot of ways, right? We can think about, do they actually know the answer to that specific question? Because we as researchers see that private answer. We can look at sort of their overall score in the area to say, is this someone who tends to know a lot or doesn't know as much, right? We see that men are more willing to contribute in male type categories than women are, right? But importantly, women are more willing to contribute in the female type categories than the men. So it's not just that men always speak up more than women. Instead, we see this important sort of context dependence where behavior seems to be a function of the gender stereotype. So you can kind of rephrase this result as being about individuals being less willing to contribute for questions that come from gender incongruent categories, right? So I'm going to use that idea of congruence, right? If my gender matches sort of the stereotype of that domain, that's going to be a congruent domain. This behavior seems largely driven by beliefs. In particular, individuals seem to be significantly more confident in gender congruent domains relative to incongruent domains. Again, holding their measured ability fixed, right? So to give you an example of this, right, maybe I had the same performance in this part one test in art and sports, right? But at least on average, I'm going to express much more confidence about my ability in art, right? How many questions I got right, whether I'm likely to have the right answer between me and my partner, whether I'm likely to be the more knowledgeable member between me and my partner in art compared to sports. So this is important, right? And I think it's important beyond just an individual level, right? So we might care about the fact that individuals in gender incongruent areas like aren't speaking up and having their voice heard and worry that that might have negative consequences for their own advancement. But it's also important from an organizational perspective, right? So it's sort of a missed opportunity in the sense that you have answers, good ideas, right answers that individuals are choosing not to contribute, right? And as a result, we're not capitalizing on those ideas. So that's what I'm going to call a missed opportunity. I'm going to define it as being a situation where an individual knows the right answer to the question, right? I see that they have the right answer privately, but doesn't sort of contribute it enough, right? Or speak up with it enough to actually have it count as the group answer. Okay. So we're going to zoom in now just for an example on only the male type domains, right? So these are just the four more male type categories in the study. And we're going to ask, right, conditional on knowing the right answer, how often does the group member fail to contribute that answer? Okay. So what you see here is that roughly a third of women's right answers aren't contributed in these male type categories. This is a significantly higher rate than the rate at which men fail to contribute their right answers. And so it's, potentially costly from a group perspective if there are right answers that aren't being volunteered. But I think the more nuanced and potentially more important finding from this figure, the x-axis is actually expertise, right? So if you look at the people who are a zero expertise, these are essentially people who know almost none of the right answers in that domain, versus people with the 5 expertise, right? You can think of these as experts, at least within the context of our study. They know a lot of right answers in this domain. What we see, right, you'd expect that sort of the rate of missed opportunities might fall with expertise, right? You realize actually you do know a lot of right answers and you should be willing to contribute them. But we actually don't see these missed opportunities fall that much with expertise, and we don't see a closing of the gender gap as expertise increases. Even among our very expert participants, right, women are failing to contribute at a much higher rate than expert men. We also see that the size of the distortion looks pretty large in the sense that, women who are experts have a same rate of missed opportunities as men sort of who don't know very much about the domain. Okay, so we're missing out on lots of good answers, right, from potentially quite expert individuals. All right. The other sort of consequence, right? So we're one, failing to hear some right answers and good ideas. A second consequence is that you might imagine in sort of a dynamic environment, right? We want to be able to recognize who the experts are because we can then give more influence to them, maybe in future meetings. Maybe we can give them leadership positions, more influence, promotions, right? We have to be able to recognize who the experts are. One way we recognize expertise is by listening to what people volunteer and speak up with, right? So another consequence of these types of missed opportunities is that groups have a harder time recognizing who the experts are. So in particular, experts in incongruent areas, so women who know a lot in male type domains, or men who know a lot in female type domains, don't speak up as much. And as a result, at the end of the study, their fellow team member is less likely to recognize that they actually knew a lot about that domain, right? So we can imagine these sort of follow-on consequences from under contribution from experts in incongruent domains. All right, so that's sort of one of the places I started with this style of research is thinking about what predicts these decisions to come forward. Now, obviously, it's a lab experiment with a lot of stylized elements. And so what you'll see over the next several studies is kind of layering in other aspects of the world that we think might be particularly important to understanding these behaviors and decisions. And so one of the things we did next, right, in this study, there was no deliberation, right? If you volunteered your answer, it was heard for the group, right? You sort of just had to decide to speak up with it and you would be listened to. Of course, that's not often how things work in the world. A lot of times we deliberate, right? You might speak up with an idea and then the group is going to discuss it, right? Or maybe the person you speak up with it to has a choice of whether to listen to it or not. And so that's what we want to do in this next study, right? And you can think of this as moving beyond just the self-stereotyping, but thinking also about how stereotypes shape how teams discuss, decide on, and give credit for ideas, right? So we're not just looking at who speaks up, but also who is listened to. And I think this is really important and underlines like a lot of the work I do is this sort of interaction between what you could think of as supply side decisions, these decisions about like, do I supply my idea? Do I assert myself? Right? Is going to be shaped at least in part from what you could think of as demand side decisions or decisions from people on the other side of the table in terms of how ideas, how people are treated when they actually put themselves forward. And so we're going to be able to look at sort of both sides of that equation in this study. So again, it's a controlled study done in person in a lab that's going to give us a lot of ability to isolate different factors. So what happens here is that teams are going to brainstorm answers to questions that are going to vary in their associated gender stereotype. And the way they're going to sort of brainstorm and deliberate is they're going to be able to use free-form chat, right? So they, again, interact over computer terminals, chatting with each other. After they discuss via chat, they take a vote, and it's a private vote on who should answer on behalf of the group. And the person chosen to answer on behalf of the group gets to decide which answer to submit as the group answer, where they all get paid more if that answer is right. And they get additional money, right, for being the one who's chosen to answer for the group. So this is a situation, right, where there's returns, both monetary and potentially reputationally, and being the one who's actually recognized as the person who should lead the group or answer for the group. So our focus is both on how men and women self-promote, right? How willing they are to sort of say, hey, you should, choose me to answer for the group. And in fact, when asked who should answer for the group, they sort of vote for themselves. And how they're ranked by others, right? Which is how likely is it that other people decide to choose them to answer for the group. So we find, right, consistent with sort of the findings from the last study, right, both an impact of the gender stereotype of the domain, which is sort of what we're talking about, right? Are we talking about something that sort of carries a male stereotype, or are we talking about something that has more of a female stereotype? And on the gender composition of the group, right? So who are my other group members? Am I talking with other women? Am I talking with a mixed group, right? That's going to matter for the decisions individuals make. So what we see is that overall, individuals are going to be more likely to self-promote or say, hey, I'm the one who should answer for the group when they're in the gender majority, right? So what we mean by that is, right, I'm a woman and my group is mostly other women, or I'm a man and my group is mostly other men. Okay, so more likely to self-promote when they're in the majority. And when we look at how they're viewed by others, we see that individuals are more likely to be chosen as that group representative, as that leader, when we're talking about gender congruent domains. So women more likely to be nominated in these female type domains, men more likely to be nominated in male type domains. And I should say, these dynamics only emerge when group members actually know each other's gender. If we're all just interacting anonymously, right, then I'm very likely to nominate a woman to answer a male typed question because I don't know that she's a woman. Okay. So we tried to do a lot to understand the dynamics a bit in this study, and in particular, sort of what happens in the chat. So what's cool is this study produces a bunch of transcripts of conversations among group members about what they think the answers are and who should answer for the group. We take those transcripts and we have them analyzed by other people, right? Other participants, and we say, tell us, sort of what you think of the people in this chat. For some of those coders, I'm going to call them coders, right? Third-party evaluators, they know the gender of the people in the chat, right? So when they see the team chatting, they know who's a man, who's a woman. For other third-party evaluators, we hide that information. Okay, so they're blind to gender in terms of their assessments of the behaviors of individuals in this chat. And so we got some really interesting things out of this analysis of transcripts. So one of the things we ask people to assess is how assertive were the different people in these chats? And what we see is that when individuals don't know the gender of who's actually talking in the meeting, the third-party evaluators actually, if anything, think women are a little bit more assertive than men in the chats. That's this positive coefficient on female in column 1. And they view them as more competent than men, right? So that's the positive coefficient on female in column 2. But interestingly, those exact same individuals in those exact same chats, when the third-party evaluator now knows that person was a woman, stereotypes seem to be activated. So the same behavior that was seen as assertive when the individual was sort of blind to characteristics is now viewed as significantly less assertive when they knew it was a woman. That's the negative coefficient on this interaction term in column 1. We see the same pattern for competence, right? You look competent when I don't see your gender, but now that I know you're a woman, that same behavior, that same sort of speaking up in a meeting, I view as being significantly less competent. Okay, so that suggests a pretty important role for stereotypes in driving how people are perceived and how the same behavior is viewed, right? Depending upon whether someone is anonymous or their gender is revealed. Okay, we see similar patterns. We ask them who made valuable contributions, who deserves extra compensation. Would you sort of bet money on this person's answer being right? And again, what we see is that in the blind evaluations, this is this first row, the coefficients on female, women, if anything, are viewed as making more valuable contributions, deserving extra compensation, and people would bet on their answer. But now, when we reveal that they were women, if anything, those effects are sort of mitigated or reversed. Okay. Again, we see evidence of bias in how team members are perceived. So I think the important question here is how can we actually improve, right? So if we wanted to say, okay, we want to have a clear-eyed view of the contributions different team members make, right? Well, one thing we could look to do is try and remove ambiguity whenever possible, right? So improve access to objective, clear information about the actual contributions each party made. Establish process and criteria in advance and commit to it if you can, right? So in this study, it would be like saying, okay, well, what does it mean to you when someone's assertive? Like, give us the definition of that, and then have them use that definition as they evaluate different people to sort of hold themselves accountable to the rubric that they could actually composed. And you can also try and compare apples to apples, right? What do I mean by that? It means, okay, rather than sort of compare this evaluate this person in isolation, evaluate the next person in isolation, so on and so forth, we can sort of put things head to head and say, here's one participant, here's another. Who do you think was more assertive, right? That sort of direct comparison has been shown in other research to have some ability to debias these evaluations. Right? The other sort of form of interventions you could think of is adding guardrails, right? And we'll give a little bit more insights on this as we move to the second half of this talk, right? But I think it just goes to show that we can have pretty fuzzy recollections, particularly of, sort of subjectively recalled conversations or events. So we want to track, we want to share, we want to reflect in terms of actually providing more reliable information to use in our evaluations, right? Maybe, like in this study, blinding is a helpful thing to rely on, at least at some stages of evaluation, where we make the evaluation without knowing the demographics of the individual involved. And then what I'll say a bit more about is also building the right process, right? So I'll go into that a bit more, but I think when we want to understand when people come forward with an idea or put themselves forward for a promotion, right? Are we rewarding the things we want to reward? Are we sort of evaluating things fairly, right? All of those decisions on our end are going to impact the choices individuals make about whether to come forward in the first place. All right, so let's transition into a different flavor of sort of decision making. And even though we're going to move from sort of contributing ideas to putting yourself forward, right, applying for promotion, I think you'll see really common themes in terms of how those decisions are made. Okay, so I think this might be one of the more popular sort of lay anecdotes out there. And it comes from Lean In, which references sort of an internal memo at Hewlett Packard. But the statistic goes men apply for an opening or a promotion when they have something like 60% of the qualifications, while women are waiting until they have 100% or more. Okay, so this statistic obviously resonates with folks. It's often sort of shared with me before I've even started to describe the research I'm about to present. And we thought this was a statistic that was worth investigating and trying to do some controlled experiments on. So what do? We run a field experiment where we try and understand the application decisions people make. And so because we're not someone's actual employer in this study, we can't offer them a promotion. But what we can do is sort of serve as the employer for a short-term gig or job, right? Think short-term contract work, right? And we can look at people's willingness to apply for sort of a challenging, lucrative short-term opportunity. Okay, and the motivation here is studying decisions about applying for a promotion, but you could also think about like raising your hand for a stretch assignment or being willing to sort of initiate a career switch or take on a project lead role, right? There are lots of ways that we can decide to sort of put ourselves forward at work. Right, so again, we're posing as the employer, as the researchers in this study, and participants in this field experiment are real workers on the platform Upwork who don't know at the time of their decision making whether they're in an experiment. So what's really nice about doing this experiment on Upwork is what we can do is sort of build a set of eligibility criteria, and then we can look at the profiles of all eligible workers in that pool. Right? So Upwork has these sort of stylized profiles that workers build themselves that include things like their work experience and their education and the types of skills they have, right? We can gather data on those workers and put together a large database of all possible workers who are eligible to apply, and then look at who actually chooses to apply, right? And that's going to allow us to compare men and women who have seemingly very similar profiles or work experience and education and ask whether they make the same decisions about whether to apply for this sort of challenging, lucrative opportunity. Okay. So the treatment variation we're going to be interested here is really going to be taking advantage of this note on removing ambiguity we talked about previously, right? And so the ambiguity here that we're going to be leveraging is thinking about what it means to actually be ready for a promotion or qualified for this opportunity. So candidates are going to be randomly assigned to either a baseline treatment where there's really only limited information on the required qualifications for our position, right? So you can think of this as having lots of ambiguity about where the bar is, right? Like, what does it mean to be good enough to actually have a shot at getting this job? In our other two treatments, right? We're going to try and reduce ambiguity, right? We're going to take the same job posting that we had in our baseline condition and try and add clearer, more objective information on exactly what we're looking for, right? And so we're going to try and provide some clarity to what the bar is. Okay, so what do we find? So we can look at the pool of workers that we know are qualified by our definition according to their profiles on the website, and we can see whether they choose to apply to this advanced opportunity. In our baseline condition, I have listed as the control here, we see that just more than 20% of qualified men choose to apply to our opening, but only 5% of qualified women do. Right? So we see a significant gender gap in the rate at which qualified workers apply for this opportunity. Our two reduced ambiguity treatments, they vary in just a small way. So the positive treatment, this is positive as in descriptive, right? What it says is, hey, we expect most applicants to have at least this qualification, right? So it's basically a description of what we think is required to actually have a shot at getting it. Our normative treatment sort of has that same language, but adds, hey, this is the required qualification, and if you have it, you should apply, right? So it adds that additional sort of encouragement or direct instruction that might be an additional nudge. Okay, so in our two reduced ambiguity treatments, right, we see no significant differences across the behavior of men, right? It continues to be the case that roughly 20% of qualified men apply under all three treatments. But for women, right, we seem to be drawing in more qualified women as we reduce the amount of ambiguity in the job posting, right? So this suggests some ability, right? If we thought, hey, this is a supply side gap, right? We see qualified women applying less often than qualified men, right? Us as an employer, right, as a manager, as a leader, we actually have the ability to change that behavior by changing the job ad we construct, right? Our decisions in terms of how we describe things, how we evaluate things, how clear we are about what the language of what we're looking for is, right? That can actually change those supply side decisions. So I'll show you another illustration of that now. So this was an example of removing ambiguity or reducing ambiguity and showing how that has an impact on sort of the behavior of workers. The other set of interventions I mentioned was thinking about potential guardrails. And the guardrail I'm going to show you some evidence on now is blinding, right? So this is the idea of removing demographic information from applications. So in this study we ran, right, our interest is sort of understanding the supply side impacts of blind applications. So what I mean by that is candidate decisions about their willingness to apply based upon whether their application is going to be evaluated blind or non-blind. So this is, again, a controlled experiment. We're going to recruit candidates for a short-term job opportunity, right, based on their coding skills. And they're going to have a choice to apply, right, with a very simple resume that's going to have an indicator for whether they're on the younger or older side of workers, right, their gender, limited information on educational attainment, sort of the subject they enjoyed studying at school, and some sample performance on a coding skills test. So what's that coding skills test, right? It consists of 10 questions like this one, right? So it says like, consider this piece of code, what's the output, right? They're gonna do 10 questions like that. That's gonna allow us to have a measure of their actual coding skills, right? And we're gonna look at sort of their willingness to apply as a function of their coding skills and whether their application would either be blind or non-blind. Okay, so candidates in our study, right, they see their profile and they're going to be randomly assigned to either see a blind profile that does not have their age and gender on it, or a non-blind sort of profile or application that will have their age and gender. We say, decide how willing you are to apply, right, for this job or this opportunity using these different resumes. Okay, so what we can look at is candidates' willingness to apply as a function of whether the application was blind or non-blind. And what we see is that it does seem to have some impact. So the first thing to note, right, our green bars are showing you men and women, right? Our orange bars are showing you younger workers and older workers. And what we see is that women and older individuals apply less, right? That seems to be true both for our non-blind applications, right? And our blind applications. But we do see differences in the sense that our gender gap and to a lesser extent our age gap are smaller when the applications are blind than when they're non-blind. And again, this isn't about actual discrimination in terms of how profiles are evaluated. This is about candidate behavior, potentially around anticipated discrimination, right? Do I apply in the first place? Is it worth it? Depending upon whether the employer is going to know my age and gender when they evaluate my application. So when you think about like the promise of an intervention like this in terms of how it actually impacts candidate behavior, right? From an organizational perspective, what I would hope for is that this is going to draw in sort of more underrepresented candidates, potentially, candidates that are harder to source, right? But maybe even more importantly, better candidates, right? Candidates who have high coding skills in this domain. Right? And so what this figure does is show you the relative demand for blinding. So how much more willing someone is to apply with a blind application than with a non-blind application. The left panel is candidates with relatively low coding skill scores. And the right panel, panel B, is candidates with better test scores, right? And what we see is demand for blinding is actually stronger for these more skilled candidates, right? Suggesting that I actually get better candidates, more candidates and better candidates when I move to blind applications. The other heterogeneity here is that the demand for blinding seems to be coming from candidates who expect discrimination, right? So whether it's in terms of gender or in terms of age, if I don't think my demographics are going to have an impact on how I'm viewed, right? I don't think there's going to be discrimination. That's panel A. Then I essentially have no relative demand for blinding, right? I'm just as willing to apply under either type of application. But when I expect negative discrimination against my type, right, discrimination against women or discrimination against older workers, that's the candidates who actually have greater relative demand for blinding. All right, so let's do one last example to kind of pull things together, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what Mass General Brigham did as well. All right, so here's a really simple example. We've talked about lots of sort of examples that have lots of social context layered on, whether it's team decision making or applying for jobs. Right here, this is just an individual decision making context. So many of you probably took some college entry exam at some point, like the SAT, right? Often a common form of this exam consists of multiple choice questions with 5 possible answers, right? Where you get a point for a right answer, you lose a quarter of a point for a wrong answer, and we're going to give you 0 points for a skipped question. Right? So if you just write it down like a math problem, right, you can maximize your expected score by guessing, okay, at least weekly. And yet, despite this, many even smart test takers skip questions. And women, particularly in more male-type domains, skip more questions than men, even conditional on having the same level of expertise. So we're seeing that same sort of flavor of missed opportunities. And I think if we look sort of across a bunch of the evidence that I showed, right, we're visiting this theme of like, should I assert my ideas myself, right? I'm asking these questions like, what do I think my chances of success are? Is going for it worth the risk? How am I going to be evaluated if I pursue it or if I fail? Right? And the challenge here is that different people are going to answer these questions in ways that are often independent of their talent, right? So whether it's a function of gender, of stereotypes, of race, of socioeconomics, of culture, of power, right? Not all your best people are, or even the people with the best ideas are necessarily going to be the ones who are most willing to put themselves or their ideas out there. Right. And that takes us back really to the example that we talked about at Mass General Brigham and sort of Their way of thinking about this problem is really sort of innovation is that same type of risky gamble, right? Where just like deciding whether or not to answer a test question, right? This comes down to like my beliefs of success, thinking about my risk and my tolerance for risk, and thinking about the sort of rewards or recognition or costs that I might face for pursuing it. And what I think is helpful about layering on this framework is it starts to highlight potential levers, right? We as an organization might be able to do things to change the way that people answer these different questions, right? So we might be able to impact perceived probabilities of success through education or mentoring or additional resources, right? We can impact perceived risk, maybe by changing the conversation about what it means to go for something and it not working out. Maybe we can provide earlier stage feedback so that it's not as risky a prospect because it's actually you haven't invested as much by the time you come forward with it. We can impact perceived reward, right? So if some of the people in this population aren't so much motivated by money, maybe we need to emphasize impact at scale, right? Or creating the recognition and positive reinforcement for coming forward with different ideas. And through all of those things, I think we can start to change sort of the norms and expectations and ways that layer up into culture change and social proof of the value of coming forward with ideas. All right, so I know we only have a few minutes left together. I'll tell you, this has led to sort of a new division at the Innovation Office at Mass General Brigham called the Innovator Growth Division. And really, their whole function is to think about how we get more people willing to participate in this innovation process, right? And they're doing this through a series of things that try and provide education and mentoring and resources, right? When we think about pulling those different levers, increasing perceived probabilities of success, decreasing perceived riskiness, and changing the forms of recognition and reward and evaluation that people face when they come forward with ideas. All right, so I'm going to close just by coming back to our test takers quickly, right? So when we thought about sort of that gender gap in willingness to guess on standardized tests, right? One strategy that might come to mind is, okay, we can close gender gaps by just pushing women to speak up more, right? Or maybe even getting men to speak up less. But what I want to encourage you to think about and leave you with in this talk is maybe there's even a better question from an organizational perspective, which is, did we even set up the system right? Right? Are we rewarding the things we want to reward? And so what's cool about this environment is that in the last couple of decades, what's happened is tests have changed the system to start removing penalties for wrong answers. When we think about pulling different levers, right, when you remove penalties for wrong answers, now it's no longer risky to guess when you're unsure. Now you don't have to worry about what you think your chances of success are, right? The evaluation is such that everyone should guess, and those incentives are very, very clear. So what happens, right? Well, I was lucky enough to get access to the Chilean college entry exam data and look at before and after this change. The green bars are illustrating questions skipped when there were penalties for wrong answers. This is the gender gap in questions skipped. We see a sizable gender gap, women skipping more questions than men, that actually grows through the quintile of test taker GPA. But when we remove penalties for wrong answers, we eliminate the gender gap in questions skipped, essentially. Okay. Of course, we don't necessarily care about test scores per se, right? Or sorry, questions skipped per se. We care about test scores. And what we see is just by removing penalties for wrong answers and getting more test takers to guess more often, we're actually able to reduce the gender gap in test performance. So we have roughly a 9 or 10% reduction in the gender gap in performance overall across these different domains. And the reduction comes largely from, you can think of top performers, right? Individuals who had lots of right answers, who weren't contributing them, right? When they were penalized for being wrong. Okay? So we can change the system, we can change the structure in ways that actually encourage more people and really talented people to guess, to volunteer ideas, right? Just by changing the system. All right, so just closing thoughts before I'm excited to hear your questions, right? awareness of biases or differences is not going to be enough to generate change, almost surely, right? And it's hard to rely on individuals to sort of recognize and correct their own self-stereotypes or biases, right? Instead, as leaders, what we can do is look to sort of change our processes, right? Either by removing ambiguity, adding guardrails, relying less on individuals to sort of self-select and assert themselves, right? In situations where it's not clear what the rewards to that are, right? So even if we can't eliminate biases, in these ways, we might be able to mitigate some of the negative consequences, right? The right process can do a lot, even if you don't or can't change the people who are actually interacting with these processes. Okay, so I will leave it there. I will stop sharing my slides, and I am excited to hear some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaufman. This was wonderful. And I mean, I am really taking out of this already some very concrete things that I, as a hiring manager, can be doing right now to make sure that I'm encouraging diversity in hiring. And I'm really excited, and I hope that others will feel just as energized as I do. Um, uh, First question, there are a number of questions I'll say in the Q&A that are related to research methods. I might invite folks to email you directly so you can get into the nitty-gritty of that. Um,
Great.
I was thinking about the fact that some of this work was done with Anne Boring, who is, of course, your collaborator and also a dear friend of mine and former colleague. And I was wondering if you've measured the impact of different analyses by both women and men, right? So do women stereotype at different rates? Have you gone into that level of detail? And I know we're talking about across multiple studies, or is that for further consideration?
Yeah, yeah. And so I would say overall, if I had to characterize the body of evidence that I've collected on this topic, that there are more similarities than differences in terms of how men and women sort of stereotype each other and
Yeah.
engage in this type of behavior. And so what I mean by that, I think that the study, I have a 2019 paper where we measure both individuals' beliefs about themselves across different domains and individuals' beliefs about others. And in that study, what we see is that on average, men and women hold very similar views. Well, let's state in two parts, right? Because it starts to get confusing who the descriptors are. So if I'm thinking about beliefs of women, like how good do I think women are at different things? Men and women hold relatively similar beliefs about how good women are.
Mhm.
Men and women also hold relatively similar beliefs about how good men are, at least
Mhm.
in terms of how they sort of stereotype across domains. And so in that way, I tend to conceptualize stereotyping as really being a little bit of a cognitive error, more so than even a motivated error, where it's not that I um, necessarily like hold a huge amount of prejudice or animus necessarily, but instead, right, I sort of have a sense of what average differences look like, and I'm like over exaggerating, right? I'm like overestimating how big those differences really are in ways that color my judgments, both of myself and of other people.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Um, Among the questions, we have a few related to culture, and I guess,
Yeah.
wondering how you separate the, right, this is it could be a completely other set of studies, but how you separate the effects of cultural differences versus gender differences in the stereotyping question.
Yeah, no, it's a super important question. And I should flag too that most of the studies I've run have been primarily conducted with participants in the United States. Some studies with college students, right? Some studies with older individuals, but mostly located in the US. I'll say I have some studies that touch on stereotypes other than gender. So one, the age study I mentioned briefly. I've also sort of run studies where people see pictures of each other, and there some ethnicity stereotypes come into play. And so the way that I at least conceptualize it is that, you know, what my research tend to show is that if you give me a stereotype, right, which is like, X group perform better than Y group, I have a pretty good set of predictions of what that's going to mean, both for how individuals in X and Y group see themselves, how individuals see members of X and Y group, and then how that's going to map into this whole array of decisions around speaking up and putting yourself forward. And so recognizing that some stereotypes are pretty common across the globe, other stereotypes might vary, right? Across country, even within different parts of a country. I have a great former student who has a project using Chinese college entry exam data where, right, the stereotype is even different across different provinces in terms of men and women and math skills, right? And so I think if you were looking to apply this to a different set of cultures or even demographic characteristics, right? The thought exercise I would encourage is, well, what do I think the relevant stereotype is here? Right. And then once you have that relevant stereotype, you can think about sort of mapping out some of these downstream consequences. But that's sort of a framework more than a set of empirical results.
Yeah, yeah, great. Question, what are the next frontiers? These are different, for this research. Where are you planning on taking this? And I don't know if Mass General Brigham is continuing its work in this regard, if you'll be accompanying them, but also I'm sure in other domains as well.
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, so Mass General Brigham is definitely continuing their work with this, and I'm at this point a special advisor to the Innovator Growth Division, and so I work closely with them on their programs around education and training and adding resources to potential innovators. I'm also, involved with them thinking about evaluating their data to understand, what progress they might be making. And so that work is certainly continuing. I've also done some work with organizations thinking more about HR processes around, hiring and career advancement and performance feedback, right? So I've written some HBS case studies around those topics, and am really hoping, designing a bunch of studies right now that really focus on conversations around performance feedback.
Mhm.
And so I have some existing studies on how individuals sort of respond to even unbiased feedback, right? So like neutral sort of machine generated feedback.
Yeah.
Don't want to get too much in the weeds, but right. And showing some of the biases just in how people interpret that, really interested in sort of moving that closer to the field and thinking about where these conversations go wrong, both in terms of how feedback is supplied, but also how feedback is received and heard and incorporated. And so I'm excited to do a lot more with that because in talking to individuals, that is like such a pain point. In thinking about career advancement, and I think also in terms of capitalizing on talent, right? As like, how do we keep people motivated and informed about how to move forward? So I'm excited to do that. And if anyone listening is thinking about these issues and wants to reach out with stories or questions, definitely encourage that as well.
Lovely. Thank you. And yes, we put Professor Kaufman's email in the chat. And so if anyone has any questions, and Jude, I'm thinking of you because you have a number of very good but precise questions about methods that I think are more suited to an email correspondence. We'll have our last question from Beth, who says, since this seems to be an inherent cognitive error across both genders, should we think differently about who presents complex or highly impactful propositions to customers or business partners? In theory, we don't want to promote stereotypes, but if the impact is real, should we leverage it? Very, very good and complicated question that I'll let you have as the last one.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, totally hear you on that. And when I teach this to MBAs, I like to always sort of have the conversation in two parts. So one, I like to have the conversation of like, how do you navigate the world as it is? Right. And then importantly, because the onus shouldn't be on you necessarily to navigate the world as it is, how do we change the world, right? How do we make things work differently? And I hear your question in that spirit a little bit, which is if we take stereotypes as sort of given at this point, at least in the short run, how might we best respond? So I would be speculating or going beyond my data a bit, but what I can tell you, at least from conversations and case studies with people, is that like if you think about female founders in startups, right, that they can often face when it comes to like the technical side, right, increased questions or scrutiny around, okay, well, like, do you actually know how this works, sort of thing. And so having a CTO there with them, right, maybe a male CTO there with them seems to be a way of sort of combating some of those misperceptions. Um, if that strategy is either unappealing or unavailable, right? The advice I would give is just being cognizant of some of these biases, right? Can you take things and like really, Deborah Kolb always says, like, make your value visible, right? Which is like, you want to be really objective and clear and data driven so that to the extent that you can remove ambiguity and subjectivity in how something is evaluated, right? You're hopefully reducing some of the space for some of these biases to be reduced. But it's hard because if we want to think about breaking down stereotypes, right? I'd love to say a strategy of having female experts in male type domains presenting highly technical stuff in super competent ways sounds like a really great idea to push back on stereotypes too. So it's a little bit of a tension there in terms of how to approach it and what your objective is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and wonderful echo to Deborah Kolb, of course, a valued member of our community. Also to end on, so Professor Kaufman, this was such a wonderful discussion. We're really appreciative. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Everyone, thank you for joining. We had over 100 people at peak on this webinar, and we will be back on October 27th for a very different discussion, but in our Kelman seminar series with Rolf Meyer on South Africa, and who was very involved in the end of the apartheid process there. So a really great discussion about a very important series of negotiations in history. Thank you everyone for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon. All right, take care.